Okay, if I recall correctly, we last left off with Automatic Terminal Information Service, ATIS. If I can get this just a sequence, then I'll be pretty happy. There we go. So interestingly enough, let's say you're flying from Bakersfield to Sacramento. About how many miles is that? Does anybody know? A couple of 100 miles. All right. So let's say you're in an airplane and you take off out of Bakersfield and you set your altimeter to the local altimeter setting in Bakersfield. If you're going to fly to Sacramento, when you're 20, 30, 40 miles out, you can probably pick up the Sacramento ATIS for Sacramento Airport. But somewhere in the middle there, you'll be more than 100 miles away from the last time you set your altimeter. And there's of them. If you're flying past Fresno Airport, you could tune in the ATIS and get the altimeter setting from them. You could also call up the flight service station, which is people that sit in front of screens and tell you about the weather, meteorology. You can also tune into something like the AWOS at Reedley Airport, because that has an altimeter setting. You could even call up an air traffic controller and ask them, but they'd wonder why you're not smart enough to listen to an automatic recording somewhere. But they'd probably do it for you if they weren't too busy. And then after they let go of the microphone, they'd say, "Hey, Fred, listen to this private pilot. They're so stupid." Oh. Don't worry, they only laugh at you when they're not transmitting. When they think they start to laugh, they let go of the transmit button. Tomahawk 3435 Juliet, turn right heading 721. They're not going to laugh. Okay. All right, so we already covered all that stuff. We listened to ATIS, and okay, good enough. All right, so if you're going to land at an airport with a control tower, then there are certain pieces of information that the air traffic controller needs to know about you and your aircraft. And so what you're going to do is let's say you're going to go into an airport that has a control tower, the first thing you're going to do is listen to ATIS. You can set your altimeter. It tells you what runway you're going to be landing on. It tells you the direction of the wind and other information that you can hear over the static. And then you're either going to call it up a control. So when I say approach control, I guess it's better if I show you a picture. And I'm going to go to airnav.net, if I recall correctly. Maybe it's airnav.com. And we're going to look at a sectional chart of the airport. Or this local area, airnav.com, okay. So I go to airports. They'll come up here shortly. I guess I got to click on it. Airports and FAT, get the airport information. And I'm going to look at an aviation sectional chart. So this is a navigation chart for VFR aircraft. And of course, let's see, we'll blow it up a little bit so it's a little easier to see. Too much. All right, so here's Reedley International. Here's Selma. What's another word for international? All right, Selma Deluxe Airport. And then here's the Fresno Yosemite International Airport. And then I've been talking about the Fresno Chandler Airport. It's on the west side of the freeway. It's magenta. So magenta means what? If it's not blue, it has no tower, okay. And then here's Sierra Sky Park. Yo, 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 what's up, Wyatt? Have we had this conversation before? Well, next time it's going to be $10 to solve your emergency. And I'll need that cash in advance. So I'll pick it up tomorrow. So those airports are all magenta. That means they don't have a control tower. But Fresno Air Terminal or Fresno Yosemite has a tower. It also has, there are some airports that just have a tower. That also have approach and departure control. Literally somebody you talk to before you get to the tower. Usually the tower is in charge of the airspace about 5 miles in diameter around the airport, and it usually goes up to 2, 3, 4, or 5,000 feet. Every size is a little bit differently. But prior to that, if it's busy enough, like at Fresno, you have to call up somebody before you call up the tower. In this case, it even tells you on the chart right down here, CTC stands for contact. It says contact Fresno approach, that's what APP stands for, within 20 nautical miles on this frequency, and the other frequencies if you're using a military radio, which you probably will not have. So what that means is when you're 20 miles out, so let's look at the scale here. Each one of these lines going up, each one of these is 1 nautical mile. So if we start at this line, there's 5, 10, 15's in here, and so here's 20. So 20 miles out. So if I'm coming into Fresno, I'm going to be calling them before, and let's just say I'm coming along this railroad track, I'm going to be calling them way out here. That's 20 nautical miles away from the airport. And I'm going to call up Fresno Approach, and there's the frequency to call them, but they're going to want some information. First of all, they want to know that I already have the information here. So let's see, I think I can be that bigger here. There it is. So they're going to want to know, I'm going to listen to ATIS first because I'm going to end up telling them that I have that information. The first thing you're going to say when you talk to the tower or approach control is your registration number. You don't have to say the N. All the airplanes that are registered in the United States, their registration starts with the letter N. So you don't have to say N. If you say it to them, they won't say anything bad. Say, oh, you don't have to say the N. It's just when they repeat your N number back to you, they won't put the N on the front. So you could say 3435 Juliet. You don't have to say N, 3435 Juliet. If you're another country, then you need to put the prefix on there. Like if you're from Mexico, I think it's X-ray. So you would say X-ray 3435 Juliet. Had a little accent that made it fun. Because you fly the private jet for the Tecate Brewery. California inside of Mexico, and they make beer. And the people that started that beer brewery were originally immigrants to Mexico from the country of Germany. So they're making German-style beer in Mexico. Now, that was like 100 years ago, so I don't know who's in charge of making the beer now. But wouldn't that be great if they hired pilots with German accents that spoke Spanish? Oh, great! If they come to the United States, they got to speak English. So there, you got to have. All you need is the German accent. You don't even have to have speak. In any case, I'm digressing. So you're going to say who you are. So you're going to say your N number, 3435 Juliet, and you're going to say who you're talking to. Fresno Approach. You don't just say approach. You're going to say the name of it. Like if you were talking to the tower, you'd say Fresno Tower. So you're going to say Fresno Approach. And then you're going to say, actually, I got those two mixed up. You want to fix that? How did I do that? I must have been drinking Tecate when I did that. So who are you talking to and who you are, and then you're going to tell them where you are and any other pertinent information about you. So you're going to say 20 miles south. You could say that you're at 2,000 feet. And that you have information, Lima is the information we had yesterday. So that way they know that you know what runways are being used, you have a good altimeter setting, they don't have to give setting, you know what the wind is, they don't have to. And you can't just say, that really true, I have ATIS. You can't say that. If you don't tell them Lima, they don't know the version of it. So they actually have to tell them which information, because after Lima, we're going to L. It's L, M, N. Mike would be next for Mike. So Mike is current. You need to go back and listen to Mike. In any case, you're going to tell them where you are, what's your altitude, and this technique, you tell them what you're going to squawk. There is a radio in the airplane, and it has 4 digits on it. In the simulator, it's on that little tiny screen on the bottom right-hand corner, and it's got 4 numbers on it, 0 through 7, and then there's 4 of them. So you can go from 000 to 7777. That is a transponder. It transmits that 4-digit code, and most of these also it transmits the altitude that's inside of your static system. Remember that static system that's going to your airspeed indicator, your altimeter, and your vertical speed? It transmits that pressure, and then the computer applies an altimeter setting to it. So it effectively, it's transmitting what you're scoring. But when they look, and they know where you are, and they know you have the right information. Got that. What you have is your the information. This part right here where it says what you have, and that's information Lima. And then what you want. You say landing Fresno, or request buzzing the tower at a low altitude. They'd probably say stand by. I'll ask if you can do that. I'd say no. The pattern is full. Nobody watches. Nobody. Request fly by the tower. Negative. The pattern is full. And then he does it anyway. Yeah, okay, all right. In any case. So you're going to set these things to approach control. They're probably going to come back, and they're probably going to say something like 3435 Juliet, squawk 12905, straight 29er left, report. So now they've told you a different squawk, so you're going to say that back to them. You're going to say 3435 Juliet, 29. We're going to say it back to this person because you got it right. So if you read, but if you read something, you say it back to them and you got something wrong, they'll correct you. So that's why it's a really good habit pattern. Unless the radio is really busy, or unless you're asleep like Jordan, you need to say back to the air traffic controller whatever they told you. That way you know that you got it right. So let's just say, let's go back to this chart here and say, all right, so let's say we're down here and they say squawk that. They might also tell you what altitude they want you to fly at, but they might not. So they said straight in 29er left. Well, I'm looking at these 2 runways, and I happen to have flown in here before. 29 left is the short one on the left, and they said report 3 miles. So that means somewhere in here, about 3 miles before I get to the runway, they want me to call them up. They might have said 5 miles, or they might have said nothing. They might just say straight in 29 left and give me a squawk, and to-do. It's like, okay, I'm heading for 29er left, and at 4, 5, or 6 miles out, they're going to call you up and 3435 change tower 118.2. See, I'm going to be really slick because I'm a pilot and I've done this a lot. I'm going to spin in my radio up here. It says CT control tower 118.2. I know they're probably going to give me that. So I'm going to have that in my radio all ready to switch over to the other side. And they'll say, Tomahawk 3435 Juliet, change the tower 118.2. You're going to say 3435 Juliet, going to tower 118.2. I'll give them a second to correct me if I'm wrong. I switch over to 118.2. I give it a few seconds and listen, so I'm not going to talk on top of somebody else who's already talking. So I'm going to wait for a second or two, and then I'm going to go Fresno Tower 34352. Now they've already told, either verbally or on a piece of paper or via computer, effectively a text message, where you are and you're coming in. So the tower already knows where you are, and they have your squawk. So you don't, unless somebody asks you to tell them where you are, you don't have to tell them. Now, usually it's a habit pattern because you're going to grow up and be a commercial pilot and be flying on instruments. Typically, when you're flying on instruments, when you change a frequency, when you get to that frequency, you also tell them, not just that you're with them on that radio frequency and what altitude. pilot, so when you switch, you can say, whatever altitude you're at, 2,500. And it's always going to be the altitude that's on your altimeter. You never give them AGL altitude. At least I can't think of a reason why you would ever give them that. And then they might say, 3435 Juliet, report 3 miles out. Or, you're clear to land, runway 29 or left. Now, when they say clear to land, whenever they talk about clearance, about a runway, whether it's a clearance to land, a clearance to take off, or you're on the ground taxiing and they give you a clearance to cross a runway, you have to repeat it back no matter what. As if you're already into that habit pattern of repeating them to them stuff, notice the difference. But it's absolutely Tomahawk 335 Juliet, clear to land, runway 29 or left. You click on say, and you don't have to say Fresno Tower because they know they're waiting for you to tell them. 3435 Juliet, clear to land, runway 29 or left. You let go and you listen. They didn't correct me. Okay, I know what I'm doing. I'm going to land on runway 29er on the left one. And when they've given you that clearance, it's if you're a car pilot, they may not ever tell you what altitude to fly. So if they fly you altitude, so now you're descent, and you don't have to tell them you're descending. All right, we're going to start with some airport markings. Has anybody ever flown at an airport or been at an airport and looked out the window and noticed there were signs and stuff like that? Okay. All right. I think we talked about red signs with white letters before. This is usually sort of a stop sign, or this is a mandatory instruction point, which is usually, this means you're coming right up on runway 927. You notice this is the 2 numbers that would be on the ends of the runway. And this sign right there, it would be right there on the taxiway just before you would enter leave the taxiway and go onto the runway. Yeah, question, Brian? A white sign that looks like this? No, because the only time you're going to see a sign that looks like this is when it's telling you that you are approaching a runway. Is your very next piece of asphalt that you're going to cross is a runway, and thou shalt not cross or get onto the runway lest ye have a clearance. Like I flew at an airport that had 2 runways, and it was common to taxi across one runway to get to another one. And so the taxi clearance, they would always say, they'd tell you which route they wanted you to take, and then they'd clear you to cross that one particular runway. And so you had to make sure that you didn't just say Roger. You had, because otherwise they're going to come back on the mic and say, clear to cross runway 12. And if you said, Roger, the next time they'd say, 3435 Juliet, please state that you are cleared to cross runway 12. Roger, I'm cleared for that. Yeah, at some point, their traffic controller is going to go, okay, either somebody's playing a joke or this person does not know what they're doing. So at some point, say, then they'd get fun. They'd say, hold short of runway 12. Do not cross runway 12. Roger, I won't do that. Because then they'd be waiting for you. You need to now say you're hold short. But all right. So we're going to look at runway markings in particular. Runways have white paint. Taxiways are yellow. Runways have white paint. So it's pretty easy. If you're taxiing along and you see the next piece of asphalt out there has white painted lines on it, that's a runway. If it has yellow painted lines, then that is a taxiway, or at least it's not the runway. Maybe that's a better way to describe it. Of course, we've looked at runway numbers before. Runway numbers are also white. And there's most of the time, there's a dotted line down the center line to help you aim for the center of the runway. That's really important, especially for larger airplanes where the landing gear sticks out either side of the center. You need to land in the runway or land in the center, because if you don't land in the center, one of your landing gear may go off the asphalt and start hitting the runway lights. And nobody likes that, because it usually makes the tire go flat and things hit the airplane, and then the airplane mechanics get mad at you. A solid white line is the runway end line. So like here's the picture. Now that one doesn't have it. I'll be darned. Here it is, right here. See this white line right there? That marks the beginning of the runway at most runways. At most runways. Question, Josh? Just airing out your pits. Okay. All right. It's also the, well, yes. But the only time it's significantly important, let's put it this way. If you're landing going down, you can't just stop here and then taxi off. So technically this is part of the runway. We talked about it the other day, but I didn't have any pictures. You see these arrows, and you notice these arrows right here are just like this top of this arrow. Okay, this means if you're coming into land, it means keep going. Keep going till you get to this big solid line. The strength of this asphalt or concrete is not as strong as the strength of the rest of the runway. Now, granted, for a little tiny airplane, it doesn't matter that much, but if you're landing an airliner and you're hitting the ground, you may hit the ground harder than the weight of your airplane. Your airplane weighs 100,000 pounds. You may land and push down on the concrete 150,000 pounds because you've got the inertia. So, we'll think about it like this. And very nicely, slowly set it down on top of your foot, but you don't drop it, you set it on your foot. It only pushes on your foot 10 pounds worth, correct? Okay. You pick up that 10-pound rock and you drop it from 3 feet onto your foot. Will it hurt the same as if you had just set it down there? No, it will hurt more. It's going to have more, because it's going to have that velocity. Same thing, hitting the ground. If it weighs the ground, it's 100,000 pounds. So they designed this runway to save money, or maybe there's other reasons and I just don't know what they are. You can taxi out here. So look where the taxi is. You taxi out here and you can start your takeoff, but you're not pushing down on the runway any more than the weight of the airplane. If the airplane weighs 100,000 pounds, you're only squishing this runway 100,000 pounds. So you can take off from here, woohoo, and get started and use that. So technically, this is part of the runway. But if you were going to land on this runway, you're not supposed to touch the wheels down until just the other side of this white line. Question, Brian? What's that? The heaviest airplane? It's probably the AN, I think it's the 225. It's that big honker, maybe it's a 125. I can't remember the numbers. It's like a C-5 Galaxy, except it's made in the Soviet Union, or now it's Russia. And they made one big one that has 6 engines instead of 4. They used it to fly the Russian space shuttle around. And I think it had like a takeoff weight of 1.4 million pounds. But they only made one, so that you got to decide. It's like the first airplane to go Mach 1, they made one. What I think is important is the first airplane that could go Mach 1, and they made a whole bunch of them. Okay. But if you look at the heaviest airplane that ever went into production, the Airbus A380, it's like 1.2 or 1.3 million pounds. They have like 500 wheels under it. I'm just kidding. I don't know how many wheels. It's a lot of wheels. And it's got a deck on top and a deck on bottom. If you put economy class and no first class in it, it would hold over 800 people. But there's enough room. They put first class and business class, so it only holds like 600 people. Only. Yeah, only. So there's some runways where you can't land that airplane because it weighs too much, like Reedley Airport. Reedley Airport's not quite long enough as well. Okay. Okay, we talked about the dotted center line, the solid white runway end. We talked about chevrons versus arrows. And let's see. Maybe I have some. Where's my chevrons? Yeah, I'm not seeing my pictures. Where'd my pictures go? Oh, man, no chevrons. Well, I'll have to draw you yellow chevrons then. Look at this. I have yellow. If you saw chevrons like this, And these chevrons go the entire width of the run of the asphalt. So chevrons like that. Then you wouldn't see the taxiway here at all. You'd see the taxiway. You'd see the taxiway coming in here. Because now what the chevrons mean, you can't take off on it and you can't land on it. So I'm going to say that again. Chevrons, they're yellow, and you can't take off on it and you cannot land on it. They're there if you're going in the opposite direction and you had an emergency, you have a little bit more asphalt while you're slowing down before you go in the dirt. But it's generally, no one's ever on it. Generally. The only time anybody's going to be on it is if their brakes went out and they were a big giant jet and they were landing in the other direction and these chevrons were on the far end of the runway. It's better to be on a weak runway and crack it a little than to go off into the dirt, because now the tires and wheels are going to catch and fold up. And now it's going to be a very expensive repair on the airplane, which would be a lot less expensive than some cracked chevrons. They are made to only be used in an emergency, such as the airplane won't stop because the brakes went out. Yes. And like I said, the taxiway wouldn't even allow you to be there. So the nice thing is, if you're on a taxiway and it gets you on a runway, you can take off as soon as you can. The only time you really have to worry about it is when you're coming into land, and that's when you have to pay attention. You have to pay attention to this. If it's chevrons, you can't land here. So whether it's chevrons or it's arrows, you still aren't supposed to land. Now, if the engine quit and I was gliding in, and all I can hear is the speed of the wind going past the airplane, I'm going to land anywhere I want. Nobody's going to complain too much. Unless I land on top of their house, then they might complain. So for practical purposes, if it's an arrow or chevron, you can't land there. And if the taxiway leads you up to it, then you can take off. But because the taxiways will never lead you up to the chevrons. The taxiways will never lead you up to the chevrons. Yeah, I must have made a pretty good mistake because I don't have the pictures here. The refrigerators. Does anybody remember that football player they called the refrigerator? It was like 10 years ago. Because he was as big as a refrigerator, I think. He was like a defensive lineman. I can't remember. Offensive lineman. I don't know. He was as big as a refrigerator. I don't know. What I want you to do is I want you to look at this refrigerator on the runway. If you were looking straight down on it, it would look like a big rectangle, like a big white refrigerator. The first refrigerator is 1,000 feet after the end of the runway. So let's see if I can draw 1,000 feet. That's 1,000 feet from the end of the runway to the full refrigerator. There, fridge does not have 2 R's in it, sorry. I can remember that. It's 1,000 feet. Think about a big giant freezer. Wouldn't you like to have 1,000 steaks in it? That's a big refrigerator. That's okay. This refrigerator is really about 10 or 20 feet wide and about 30 or 40 feet long. You could put 1,000 steaks in a refrigerator that big. So what that also means is all these other things here, they're all 500 feet from the end. So that's 500 feet. And then, of course, it's another 500 feet to get to the refrigerator because the refrigerator's at 1,000 feet. And then all the other ones are 500 feet. So you could argue that there is a runway marking, if they put them on there, because on some runways, little runways, they don't have them. Each one of these markings from here to there is 500 feet, 500 feet, 500 feet to that one, 500 feet to that one, 500 feet, and 500 feet. But the refrigerator, the big giant refrigerator, it's at 1,000. The nice thing is, if you're in a little tiny airplane and they've got this stuff painted, that's a reasonably long runway. If you got the wheels on the ground, by the time you got to the big refrigerator, you're always going to have enough room to land. Typically, you only find this on runways that are 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 feet or longer. And a Piper Tomahawk doesn't even need 1,000 feet to land. Not even 1,000 feet. So let's see what else I forgot to put in here in the way of pictures. The refrigerators. The yellow X. If you're flying over an airport and you see a big yellow X on both ends of the runway, they'll usually put it on each end of the runway, maybe even in the middle. A big yellow X means the airport is closed. Typically, correction, not the airport, that runway is closed. The runway is closed. Actually, if you go to Fresno Chandler Airport, they have a closed runway. Let's see if it shows up on Google Earth. FCH, Fresno Chandler Airport. This runway was made in World War II, or at least it was used in World War II. And look at that. There's this second runway. And you notice they're Xing them out on the airport diagram. If we had a really good picture, you notice this actually has two runways. And this second runway over here, there's big X's on it. So I'm going to try Google Maps. Let's go to satellite. Look, now theirs are in white, but look, they got X's. That's where the second runway used to be. When I first flew into Chandler, they actually had a control tower, and they actually had both runways open. But the city decided not to maintain it, and that's a valid reason for closing a runway, is that it's not safe to land, like there's potholes in it, or it's cracked, or something underneath it, the dirt has settled and there's a sinkhole in it or something like that. So if you see the X, it's not that it's against the law to land on it, but if you land on it, you better have a reason that's more important than it's a broken up runway. Like if the engine quits and you're just coming in to land and all you can hear is the wind blowing against the airplane, and you can land on that runway but you can't get to the other runway, that would be a valid reason. That's pretty much the only reason it's okay to land on a closed runway that's got an X, is if the engine has quit and there's no other choice. Of course, here, I'd land, there's a taxiway right next to it. Look, see, here's this runway. Look, there's a taxiway 50 feet away right next to it. I would land on that taxiway. That taxiway looks pretty nice. And just for fun, if you ever go to Fresno and you go to the airport there, this building right here, it won't let me zoom anymore. This is the old air terminal that was at this airport in the 1930s. I guess they built this airport before World War II, and they refurbished it so it looks like Art Deco from the 1930s. And right next to it, this building right next to it, that's Fresno Flyers. That is a pilot flight school. And somewhere in one of these other hangars is a helicopter flight school called American Helicopters. And they got a couple of airplanes now. They're doing airplane flight instruction. So now there's three places in Fresno you can take flying lessons. Did somebody go to Visalia and you found there weren't any places to do flight instruction in Visalia? No? Nobody went to Visalia? Okay. It's all right. Well, let's see. Yep, all the pictures are gone. So, I'm just going to have to show you pictures the hard way. Here, this one's pretty good. So, here is, let's look at the image full screen. There we go. So, the white are the things that are on the runway, and the yellow are the taxiway lines. You notice on the taxiway lines there is a solid line in the middle of the taxiway. What I also want you to notice, you see how here we're coming up on this runway. So on these arrows, can we take off on the arrows? Yeah, we can take off on the arrows. All right. So look, see how big the refrigerators are? How far away are the refrigerators from the beginning of the runway? 1,000 feet. Okay, all right. So if you were, well, we'll get to that here. If you look at these two sets of lines, there's two solid lines and two dotted lines. Has anybody driven a car? 1, 2, 3 of you. Okay, great. 3 of you have driven a car while conscious, and 1 has driven the car when he's unconscious. When you're driving down the road and the other side of the road has a solid line, but on your side it's a dotted yellow line, pass. Yeah, so it's okay. If there's no traffic, you can pass. How about those people on the other side that the solid line is next to? Can they pass? No. So can they cross that line? No, but you can. You can pass. You can cross the line as long as the dotted side is towards you. Obviously, as long as there's no traffic. Same theory here. If I come up to this and it's two solid lines, I cannot cross these double lines unless the tower or the ground control gives me permission to go onto the runway. So if you come up on these two sets of lines, or 4 lines if you prefer, and the solid is towards you, you have to stop and let no part of the aircraft go past the first line. It's not where you are, it's not the engine, it's not the wheels, it's any part of the wing or the tail or anything like that. None of it can go past it unless either the tower gives you permission or the ground controller gives you permission. Because they might want you to taxi on across that runway to get somewhere else, so it might be the ground controller. However, let's look at it and say, let's say you just landed. Let's say you landed in this direction here. You landed and you went here and you taxied and you come up against and you're now on the dotted lines. Dotted lines. In a car, if I have the dotted lines, it's okay for me to cross the line. Same thing here. If you're going to see these dotted lines are towards the runway, so that means if you're leaving the runway, and the dotted lines are towards you, it means you can cross it without permission. So if you're landing and the tower says 3435 Juliet, you're cleared to land on runway 270 or runway 27, then you're going to land going in this direction. In this case, it's from right to left. You're going to land hopefully straight and not screwy like I'm landing. And you're going to come up to this, and without anybody saying anything, you're going to cross that set of lines. You could do it here. You could cross these set of lines. But as soon as, and if the tower doesn't give you any other explanations, as soon as you get on the other side of the line, and all of your airplane has to get on this side of the line. Remember, I didn't tell you. As soon as one part of your aircraft gets past that first line, pow, you're on the runway. Technically now, the air traffic controller, if anybody's coming in to land, they have to tell them to go around. Because you're technically on the runway. So this is when the air traffic controller calls you and says, please call the tower when you get back to parking. And then they'll find out who you are, and then the FAA will come talk to you, and then you will be unhappy. But when you're so none of your aircraft can go past it without permission. When you're getting off the runway, all of your aircraft has to get past that double line, and then you stop. And you call ground control and say, I am at taxiway Bravo, taxi to JB Aeronautics. Now it's possible if the tower says contact ground, or you're clear to land, or usually on the runway they'll say 3435 Juliet, contact ground when clear of the runway. If you're not too busy, you can respond to say 3435 Juliet, contact ground, clear of the runway. But you're going to wait until after. You don't call the ground control while you're still on the runway. You wait until the last bit of your airplane has crossed that line, and then you're going to stop because you don't know what airplanes are cleared to, or helicopters are cleared to taxi down runway Alpha. So you're going to stop right there. Now, some of your airplane may stick out into that taxiway, but that's okay. The point is that you get off of the runway and no part of your airplane is on the inside of that double line. So did I lose anybody there? All right. Next thing I want to talk about is this line right here. This is the ILS hold line. Well, let's see. Let me make sure I got the nomenclature right. Dun-dun-dun, center line, not moving there, ILS. So that right there is the runway hold line. So if you were going to write notes right there on the runway hold short line, you're going to say, never go onto the runway without permission. And no part of your aircraft. See the paper I gave out yesterday? It's not on any piece of paper I ever gave you in your whole life. And I'm having a bad week then. It's the same for helicopters. That's a good question. Absolutely 100% the same. Except in a helicopter, instead of taxiing around on the ground, if you have skids and no wheels, you're going to be hovering 3 feet up in the air. But everything I just said is identical. You can't let even your rotor blades out there in front of you, you can't let them get out there past that line unless you get clearance to go get onto the runway. And if you're leaving the runway, you have to make sure even your tail rotor is off and past the double yellow lines. Yes, you can. Can you just land at the place where you're going to go? And the answer is yes. Generally speaking, at airports, the air traffic controllers will have you go somewhere. They almost never have you land on the runway because you get in the way of the airplanes, because helicopters end up flying really, really slow, and the airplanes have to keep flying, otherwise they fall out of the sky. And controllers will not ask an airplane to fall out of the sky. So they usually have you come in and do an approach to a taxiway or to a parking spot for aircraft. So no, you almost never go to the runway on a helicopter. I'll tell you what, since I didn't give you that notes and we want to catch up in careers, we're going to say it's 11 after, we'll say 22 after in the classroom, in the computer lab, 22 after.